You step onto the slick streets of Brooklyn 1930. Rain glistens on cobblestones, neon signs flicker in puddles, and every shadow hides a story. Across the city, whispers speak of men who control empires without firing a shot, who move in silence but shape the fate of hundreds. One boy arrives from Sicily, eyes sharp, mind sharper. Another, patient and calculating, begins his climb from a driver's seat to the helm of a criminal dynasty. In the world of the five families, loyalty is currency, betrayal is fatal, and power favors the patient. This is the story of Carlo Gambino and Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, legends of New York's underworld, whose lives will define a city that never sleeps. Carlo Gambino was born into a world where silence could be as dangerous as a shout, where loyalty was bought and sold like currency, and where a single misstep could determine your fate before you even reached adulthood. Palermo in the early 1900s was a city of contrasts. Sun-baked piazzas filled with laughing children and street vendors, shadowed alleys where secrets festered, and the endless whisper of the Mediterranean lapping against the harbor. Carlo's family lived modestly, but wealth was measured not in coins but in reputation, respect, and the ability to navigate the unspoken rules that governed every corner of the city. From an early age, Carlo watched, absorbed, and learned. He watched the way older boys dominated games of chance, the way merchants settled disputes with subtle nods or flashes of temper, the way a neighbor might suddenly disappear after offending the wrong person. Every glance, every gesture, every word mattered. He learned that survival required more than strength. It required observation, patience, and a mind sharp enough to see the next move before it was played. Even as a boy, he understood that power was a game and he was a student of it. His family believed in hard work, in quiet discipline. Carlo helped with chores, delivered messages, ran errands, but always with an awareness that the streets themselves were a teacher. He would follow older men who seemed powerful, study their patterns, note how respect was commanded, how threats were veiled in humor, how alliances could shift with the slightest provocation. He began to understand instinctively the dynamics of authority, the subtlety of influence, and the dangerous weight of reputation. By the time he reached his early teens, Carlo had witnessed enough to know that life was a negotiation in every sense. He observed betrayal and loyalty side by side, noting how easily trust could be broken and how quickly fortunes could reverse. One afternoon, he watched a boy snatch a piece of bread from a younger sibling. Carlo did not intervene. Instead, he studied the boy, noting his posture, his confidence, the flicker of arrogance in his eyes. He catalogued every detail, storing lessons for a future that was already forming in his mind. The decision to leave Sicily was the first monumental step in Carlo's life. His family, like many others, sought opportunity in America, a place that promised wealth and freedom but demanded cunning and resilience. Carlo, now in his late teens, stepped aboard a steamship bound for New York. The journey was long and arduous, filled with seasickness, cramped quarters, and the constant hum of anticipation and fear. He stood on deck, eyes scanning the horizon, contemplating the life ahead. He knew that the streets of Brooklyn would be no gentler than the alleys of Palermo. They would be harsher, more chaotic, and brimming with men who understood violence as a tool and silence as a weapon. Landing in Brooklyn was a shock to the system. The streets were crowded, noisy, and pungent with coal smoke, wet asphalt, and the aroma of fresh bread and baking pizza. Neon signs flickered along avenues slick with rain from an earlier storm, and the city pulsed with a rhythm all its own. Carlo navigated the sidewalks with careful eyes, noting the interactions around him. The pushcart vendors negotiating over pennies, the children darting through the crowds, the older men asserting their presence with subtle gestures that held the weight of authority. The city was alive, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but it was a place where he could carve a path, if he had the skill and patience. Work came quickly though not easily. Carlo took on small jobs, delivering messages, guarding shipments, running errands, that allowed him to observe the subtle rules of street life. Every interaction, no matter how minor, was a lesson. A nod from a local crew could signify trust. A glare could signal danger. He learned to recognize the men who could be allies, and those who could not be trusted for a second. These lessons, absorbed in silence and observation, became the foundation of his emerging strategy: patience, calculation, and precise action. Brooklyn was a city of microcosms. Each block had its own hierarchy, each family its own code, each alley its own rhythm of power. Carlo learned to move through these spaces with the awareness of a chess player, anticipating moves, calculating risks, and measuring influence. By the end of his first year, he had made contacts, small, cautious alliances that could later be leveraged into loyalty. He had observed betrayal, noted weakness, and begun to understand that success was a matter of timing, perception, and decisiveness. It was during this period that Carlo began to encounter the nascent structure of the Mafia in New York. Small crews controlled streets, extorted businesses, and enforced loyalty with a mixture of intimidation and subtle persuasion. He watched, listened, and learned. There were no formal lessons, no manuals, only the lived experience of those who navigated power with precision. Carlo understood that every favor done, every debt paid, and every handshake carried weight. He began to internalize these lessons, slowly building a reputation for intelligence, discretion, and reliability, qualities that would later distinguish him in the Five Families. As adolescence gave way to early adulthood, Carlo's sense of strategy sharpened. He began to take on more responsibility within the local crews, overseeing small operations, mediating disputes, and carrying messages that required both trust and judgment. Each success added to his reputation. Each misstep offered insight into the fragility of influence. By carefully choosing whom to align with, observing rivalries, and understanding the balance of power, he carved out a place for himself. A place that would, over the years, expand into something much larger and far more dangerous. Through all of this, Carlo never lost the sense of calculation that had defined his youth. Every encounter was an opportunity, every observation a lesson. Even in moments of leisure, walking the streets, observing children at play, listening to arguments over trivial matters, he absorbed knowledge. The city itself became a living classroom, teaching him patience, timing, and the subtle art of control. By the time he reached his early 20s, Carlo Gambino had begun to transform from a young immigrant boy into a figure of careful influence, someone who understood the levers of power long before he had any need to act upon them. By the end of this formative period, Carlo was no longer just a newcomer in Brooklyn. He had begun to weave himself into the fabric of the city's underworld. He knew the men he could trust, the ones who could be manipulated, and those who were threats to his rising influence. More importantly, he had learned the rules of a game that required both cunning and restraint, patience and aggression, observation and decisive action. He understood that the path ahead would be treacherous, that alliances were fragile, and that the measure of a man was not only in what he could achieve but in how skillfully he navigated the dangers of ambition. And so, as Brooklyn's streets glimmered under the last light of a setting sun, Carlo Gambino took his first real steps into the world that would define his life. Not yet a boss, not yet a legend, but a young man whose mind, patience, and ambition would soon make him one of the most formidable figures in the American underworld. You watch him walk away from the docks, into alleys and streets alive with opportunity and threat alike, and you realize that this is only the beginning. The game has started, and Carlo Gambino is ready to play. Brooklyn was a city that demanded attention. Every corner held a story, every alley a lesson, and every man or woman walking past carried the potential for opportunity, or threat. Carlo Gambino had arrived as an immigrant, a newcomer from Sicily, but by now he had learned that mere presence in these streets meant nothing. Survival, influence, and eventual power came from understanding the rules that no one would ever write down. The early days were mundane but instructive. Carlo took small jobs in the neighborhoods, delivering packages, running errands for merchants, even acting as a courier for minor crews that collected debts and enforced minor protections. On the surface, it was work for pocket change. Beneath it, it was an education in human behavior, street politics, and the subtle levers of power. He moved quietly, watching more than speaking. In the crowded streets of Bensonhurst and Carroll Gardens, he learned the value of observation. The way a man gestured, the tilt of a hat, the tone of a casual conversation. Everything could signal allegiance or danger. Carlo's sharp eyes catalogued everything. When two men argued over a dice game in the street, he noted which side drew the support of onlookers. When a vendor refused to pay protection money, he saw who would quietly intervene and who would step back. These were not random incidents, they were lessons in authority, strategy, and human nature. As Carlo gained confidence, he began to make contacts within the small crews that patrolled Brooklyn's neighborhoods. These men were a mix of Italian immigrants, Sicilians, and a few hardened Americans who had learned early how to assert themselves. Carlo recognized that brute force alone was rarely enough. Timing, patience, subtle threats, and, above all, the perception of intelligence carried more weight than muscle. He made himself useful, not by challenging anyone immediately, but by showing reliability and discretion. One evening, he accompanied a local capo to oversee a shipment of goods moving through a warehouse near the waterfront. The warehouse smelled of fish, tobacco, and damp wood. Crates of imported fabrics were stacked high, and men moved silently, each aware of the potential for trouble. Carlo observed everything. The minor crew members, the way the capo spoke without raising his voice, the subtle signals used to coordinate actions. In those silent moments, Carlo understood the intricate choreography of organized crime. Everyone had a role, and the smallest misstep could ruin an operation. Over time, Carlo began to earn respect among the lower-tier crews. They noticed his calm demeanor, his ability to anticipate problems, and the way he carried himself with quiet authority. He learned to negotiate, to mediate disputes without drawing attention to himself, and to perform favors that, though small, demonstrated reliability. These were not acts of heroism. They were calculated steps in establishing trust, building relationships, and marking him as someone who could one day wield real influence. It was not all cautious observation. Carlo's first real test came when a minor dispute turned violent. A small crew attempted to muscle in on a local business that had already been under protection. Words were exchanged, tensions escalated, and the threat of violence hung over the narrow streets like a storm cloud. Carlo, still young, had to make a decision: step back, intervene, or find a middle ground. He chose the middle ground, negotiating subtly, calming tempers, and allowing both sides to save face. The outcome was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it earned him notice. He was no longer just a bystander. He had shown initiative, judgment, and the ability to act without drawing unnecessary attention. As the months turned into years, Carlo's reputation began to grow. He became known as a man of discretion, someone who could be relied upon to carry out delicate tasks without unnecessary fanfare. He was neither flashy nor violent without cause. Instead, he was patient, calculating, and always aware of the next move. The young Sicilian had become an emerging figure in Brooklyn's underworld, quietly weaving himself into the fabric of power that ran beneath the city's surface. One of the most important lessons Carlo learned in these early years was the value of alliances. In Brooklyn, no man could rise alone. Power was maintained through networks, favors, and sometimes intimidation, but always through connections. Carlo observed rival crews, noting who was loyal to whom, who was ambitious, and who was willing to betray their own for a chance at advancement. He began to cultivate relationships carefully, favoring discretion over overt action, subtlety over showmanship. Every handshake, every nod, every small favor was a step toward securing a future that would one day place him at the pinnacle of the five families. By the time Carlo was in his early 20s, he had achieved a measure of influence that few newcomers could hope for. He knew which streets were controlled by which crews, who held grudges, and who could be persuaded or intimidated. He understood the dynamics of respect and fear, and he had begun to maneuver himself into a position where his decisions carried weight. Even at this stage, he moved with restraint, careful not to draw attention to himself while building the foundation of power. During this period, Carlo also learned the importance of patience. The streets of Brooklyn moved quickly, but influence moved slowly. He observed men who acted impulsively, whose ambition led them to miscalculation, and he took note. His strategy was to act only when necessary, to cultivate patience as a weapon, and to let others reveal their weaknesses before making his own move. It was a slow, meticulous process, but it was effective. Carlo was building a reputation as someone who understood the game before it began, who anticipated moves before others even considered them, and who remained calm even in moments of tension. The city itself became a teacher. Carlo watched the ebb and flow of business, the rhythm of street life, the rise and fall of crews, and the subtle shifts in alliances. He began to understand the importance of information, who knew what, when, and how to act upon it. Every observation was a lesson, every encounter a piece of the puzzle. He learned that power was not always demonstrated through violence. Sometimes it was shown through control of knowledge, the ability to anticipate, and the patience to wait for the right moment. By the end of his formative years in Brooklyn, Carlo Gambino had transformed from a Sicilian immigrant boy into a young man whose mind, patience, and ambition marked him for something greater. He had made allies, avoided unnecessary conflicts, and positioned himself in the complex web of street-level power. His understanding of loyalty, timing, and strategy had grown, and he was ready to take the next steps that would ultimately lead him to the top of the five families. Brooklyn had shaped him, tested him, and taught him lessons that could not be learned in Palermo or on a steamship. And as Carlo Gambino moved through the streets, observing, calculating, and preparing, it became clear that he was no longer just a participant in the game. He was beginning to define it. Brooklyn in the 1930s was a city of whispers, shadows, and deals made in the quiet corners of darkened streets. Carlo Gambino, now a young man hardened by the lessons of Palermo and the trials of immigrant life, had learned to read the pulse of the city. He understood that survival was only the first step. Power demanded more. Alliances, timing, discretion, and a mind always thinking 3 steps ahead. It was during this period that Carlo encountered the Mangano family, one of the most organized and feared criminal operations in Brooklyn. They were a family in the truest sense, their influence stretching from waterfronts to factories, their name carrying weight in every bar and butcher shop along the borough's streets. Carlo had heard their reputation whispered in markets, over the clatter of carts and the casual chatter of street vendors. Men spoke cautiously of the Mangano family, the respect they commanded palpable even among other crews. Carlo's introduction to the family was not dramatic. There was no sudden confrontation or violent initiation. Instead, it came through a series of small tasks, a delivery here, a favor there, a silent observation of a conflict that Carlo resolved without fanfare. The family noticed his composure, his patience, and the intelligence with which he approached every situation. He was reliable, discreet, and capable of reading people as easily as he read the streets. These were qualities that could not be taught. They were intrinsic, honed over years of careful observation and self-restraint. His first formal assignment involved overseeing the movement of goods along the Brooklyn waterfront. Crates of imported textiles and shipments of coal passed under the watchful eyes of the Mangano crew. Carlo was instructed to ensure they reached their destinations without interference from rival gangs or law enforcement. At first glance, the task seemed simple: guard the shipments, report any irregularities. But Carlo quickly recognized the deeper lesson. Each shipment was a microcosm of influence and power. He observed the subtle gestures of the dock workers, the hierarchy among the crew, and the silent communications that passed unnoticed by outsiders. It was in these early assignments that Carlo began to understand the mechanics of organized crime in America. Violence was present, but it was measured and calculated. Authority was maintained not only through intimidation but through control, reputation, and strategic alliances. Carlo took careful notes, mentally cataloging who could be trusted, who might betray, and who held influence beyond their apparent role. As weeks turned into months, Carlo's responsibilities increased. He was asked to mediate disputes, supervise collections, and relay sensitive information to higher-ups. Each task, though small, carried weight. A single mistake could draw unwanted attention or cause friction between crews. Carlo approached these duties with a combination of caution and decisiveness. He learned to act quickly when necessary, but to weigh every option before making a move. His patience became a weapon as formidable as any physical force. One of his first notable successes came during a dispute between 2 minor crews over control of a neighborhood bar. Words had been exchanged, tempers flared, and the threat of violence hung in the air. Carlo stepped in quietly, listening to both sides, analyzing their motivations and weaknesses. Through subtle persuasion and careful negotiation, he managed to broker a compromise that satisfied both parties without bloodshed. The result was nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but to the Mangano leadership, it was a demonstration of intelligence, tact, and reliability. Carlo's reputation began to grow, not as a brute enforcer but as a man who could handle complexity with skill. It was during this time that Carlo learned the critical importance of observation and timing. He watched how orders were given and followed, how respect was earned and lost, and how loyalty could be both fragile and powerful. He realized that the true strength of a man in the underworld was not just measured by his ability to fight, but by his capacity to predict, anticipate, and influence events before they unfolded. Carlo also began to understand the delicate balance between fear and respect. Within the Mangano family, men who were too ruthless too quickly were often eliminated or sidelined. Those who were too cautious never rose. Carlo found the equilibrium, a man who could act decisively when required but who exercised restraint, who earned trust, and who understood that power was as much about perception as action. During these formative years, Carlo was also learning about alliances beyond Brooklyn. The 5 families were beginning to take shape, and interfamily politics were as complex as the streets themselves. He paid attention to these dynamics, observing which families cooperated, which competed, and which played a careful game of patience and influence. Carlo internalized these lessons, knowing that his future would depend not just on local influence but on the ability to navigate a larger, more intricate web of power. One night, Carlo was summoned to meet with one of the family's capos, a man whose reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness was well known. The meeting was quiet, held in a back room of a small warehouse near the docks. Carlo observed the man carefully, his posture, his manner of speech, the subtle way he gauged Carlo's responses. The capo offered him a series of tasks: oversee a series of small collections, monitor rival activity, and report any anomalies. Each task was a test, not just of skill but of judgment, loyalty, and discretion. Carlo accepted without hesitation, understanding that this was the beginning of a path that could define his life. As Carlo completed these tasks over the next year, he began to build a network of contacts and influence. Minor crews deferred to him when necessary, rival factions acknowledged his presence, and his reputation for reliability and intelligence spread quietly. He learned the nuances of negotiation, the art of subtle intimidation, and the power of strategic silence. Every success increased his standing, and every mistake was meticulously analyzed to ensure it would not recur. By the time Carlo was in his mid-20s, he had become a recognized figure within the Mangano family, trusted with sensitive operations and respected for his judgment. He had learned the importance of patience, discretion, and strategic thinking. He understood that the streets of Brooklyn were not merely a place of survival, but a training ground for influence, power, and eventually, control. Carlo Gambino's rise within the Mangano family was not sudden. It was deliberate, calculated, and informed by years of observation, study, and careful action. He had transformed from a Sicilian immigrant boy into a young man whose mind and instincts marked him for leadership. The lessons of Palermo, combined with the practical experience of Brooklyn streets and the mentorship within the Mangano family, had forged a foundation that would allow him to ascend to the pinnacle of New York's organized crime. It was here, among the warehouses, docks, and shadowed streets of Brooklyn, that Carlo Gambino began to write his own legend. He understood the rules, respected the hierarchy, and played the game with a combination of intelligence, patience, and discretion that few could match. The city was vast, dangerous, and full of opportunity, and Carlo was ready to claim his place within it. By the mid-1930s, Carlo Gambino had earned a quiet reputation. Within the Mangano family, his name was spoken with a mixture of respect and cautious acknowledgement. He was no longer just a newcomer, a courier, or a minor enforcer. He had proven himself capable of discretion, intelligence, and decisiveness. But Brooklyn's underworld was not a place where reputation alone guaranteed influence. It demanded action, strategy, and the ability to navigate the constant tension between loyalty and ambition. Carlo's first real step into leadership came through responsibility. The Mangano family began to entrust him with overseeing crews of lower-level men, delegating operations that required both judgment and authority. These were not glamorous tasks, collecting debts, monitoring shipments, ensuring local businesses paid for protection, but they were crucial. And Carlo approached each one with the same meticulous attention to detail he had always applied. He was patient, deliberate, and constantly aware of the eyes watching him, measuring every word, every gesture, every decision. One evening, Carlo was assigned to supervise a dispute between two crews that threatened to erupt into violence over control of a warehouse near the waterfront. He arrived early, surveying the area, noting the positions of each man, the subtle cues in their posture and tone. When the crews began arguing, Carlo stepped in, not with force but with calm authority. He asked questions, deflected provocations, and guided the conversation toward a resolution that allowed both sides to save face. The compromise went unnoticed by outsiders but marked him as a man capable of leadership and foresight. This moment was more than a simple negotiation. It was the first test of his strategic mind. Carlo understood that leadership required the ability to manage egos, predict reactions, and control outcomes without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. From this point forward, his influence began to grow. Crew members respected him not for fear alone, but because he demonstrated intelligence, patience, and an understanding of the complex web of relationships that governed their lives. Promotion within the family came incrementally. Carlo's success in managing operations, resolving conflicts, and executing orders earned him the attention of higher-ups. He was offered the role of capo, a position that brought authority over multiple crews and direct responsibility to the family's leadership. Acceptance of the role was not automatic. It required a demonstration of loyalty, skill, and a capacity for both subtlety and decisiveness. Carlo was ready. As capo, Carlo's responsibilities expanded. He oversaw protection rackets, ensured that shipments and collections ran smoothly, and acted as an intermediary in disputes both within and outside the family. The scope of his influence widened, and with it, the complexity of his decisions. Each choice could impact not only his standing but the stability of the family itself. Carlo approached these challenges with careful calculation, always weighing risk against reward, patience against opportunity. At the same time, Carlo's personal life remained tightly controlled. He understood that vulnerability could be exploited, and he maintained a careful separation between family and criminal enterprise. Social gatherings, dinners, and public appearances were navigated with precision. He cultivated relationships that enhanced his reputation, both within the Mangano family and in the broader network of Brooklyn's underworld. Every interaction was an opportunity to observe, learn, and influence. Carlo's rise to capo was also marked by moments of tension and danger. Rival crews tested his authority, law enforcement applied pressure, and internal politics threatened to undermine his position. Yet he remained steady, relying on a combination of strategy, observation, and calculated action. He knew that the appearance of calm was as important as the exercise of power itself. Men would follow someone who projected confidence and control. They would hesitate before challenging a leader who appeared unshakable. During this period, Carlo began to refine his approach to alliances. He recognized that loyalty was both fragile and essential. He cultivated trust carefully, offering favors that reinforced bonds and signaling reliability in subtle ways. He observed rival leaders, noting their strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies. By understanding the motivations of those around him, he could anticipate conflicts, manage threats, and position himself advantageously. It was a game of influence, patience, and perception, a game in which Carlo excelled. Carlo's tenure as capo also exposed him to the darker realities of organized crime. Violence was inevitable, and he witnessed firsthand the consequences of betrayal and miscalculation. He observed men who acted impulsively, whose ambition led them to mistakes, and whose failures were punished swiftly and often brutally. These lessons reinforced the importance of restraint, planning, and strategic thinking. Carlo understood that power was not maintained by fear alone. It was maintained by a combination of respect, foresight, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics. As capo, Carlo began to exert influence beyond his immediate operations. He coordinated with other capos, mediated disputes between crews, and participated in planning sessions that shaped the family's broader strategy. His role required diplomacy, negotiation, and, when necessary, decisive action. He balanced competing interests, managed egos, and ensured that operations continued smoothly. Through these experiences, Carlo honed the skills that would eventually allow him to rise to the highest ranks of the five families. By the late 1930s, Carlo Gambino had transformed from a newcomer in Brooklyn to a recognized figure within the Mangano family. His reputation for intelligence, discretion, and strategic thinking set him apart from others, and his influence continued to grow. He was no longer just a soldier executing orders. He was a leader, a strategist, and a man whose decisions carried weight. The streets of Brooklyn had shaped him, but it was his mind and patience that would ultimately define his ascent. Even as he consolidated power, Carlo remained vigilant. He understood that threats could emerge from any quarter. Rivals within the family, competing crews, and law enforcement all posed risks. He maintained awareness, observing the subtle signs of discontent, betrayal, and opportunity. His approach was measured and deliberate, allowing him to act decisively when necessary, while avoiding unnecessary conflict. This balance of patience and action became a hallmark of his leadership style. As Chapter 4 closes, Carlo Gambino stands as a man transformed. The lessons of Sicily, the trials of Brooklyn streets, and the experience gained within the Mangano family have forged him into a capable leader. He commands respect without overt display, wields influence with precision, and navigates danger with calculated skill. The path ahead remains fraught with challenges, rivalries, and potential betrayal, but Carlo is prepared. His rise from soldier to capo marks the beginning of a trajectory that will lead him to the pinnacle of New York's criminal world, a journey defined by intelligence, strategy, and an unwavering understanding of power. By the early 1950s, Carlo Gambino had become more than a capo. He was a force within the New York underworld. The Mangano family had grown in size, influence, and ambition, but so too had the complexity of its operations. Rivalries simmered not just on the streets of Brooklyn but across Manhattan, Queens, and even Staten Island. Alliances were fragile. Loyalties were tested daily. In this environment, Carlo Gambino had learned that leadership was less about brute strength and more about perception, strategy, and patience. His rise to the position of boss of bosses was neither sudden nor violent. It was calculated, deliberate, and informed by decades of careful observation and subtle maneuvering. Carlo understood that to maintain power, one had to manage not only the operations of the family but also the ambitions and egos of the men within it. He had seen the consequences of impulsive decisions and rash behavior, and he had chosen a different path: measured influence, careful timing, and the strategic application of both generosity and intimidation. The first step in consolidating his authority was to secure loyalty from the family's capos. Carlo met with them individually, listening more than speaking, gauging their ambitions, their concerns, and their willingness to follow his direction. He offered guidance, resolved disputes, and in subtle ways demonstrated that his leadership was both steady and advantageous. Men responded not out of fear alone, but because they recognized his acumen and the stability he could provide in a world rife with uncertainty. Carlo's leadership style was built on strategic subtlety. He avoided unnecessary displays of force, preferring to influence outcomes behind the scenes. Decisions were communicated in ways that respected the pride of others while establishing his authority. He understood that loyalty cultivated through respect and shared interest was more durable than that imposed by intimidation. Yet he did not shy away from demonstrating the consequences of betrayal. His reputation for decisive, calculated action ensured that potential challengers thought twice before testing him. As boss, Carlo oversaw a vast network of operations: protection rackets, gambling establishments, unions, and illicit shipments. Each operation required oversight, discretion, and strategic thinking. He maintained communication with his capos and soldiers, ensuring that operations ran smoothly while keeping his personal involvement limited to where it was most impactful. This approach allowed him to remain both effective and untouchable, above the petty squabbles and dangerous street-level confrontations. The five families of New York, Gambino's own family, along with the Lucchese, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, required careful negotiation and diplomacy. Carlo recognized that power in the city was not held by one family alone. It was a balance maintained through alliances, agreements, and the threat of retaliation. He attended clandestine meetings, mediating disputes, setting boundaries, and ensuring that his family's interests were protected while avoiding unnecessary conflict. His ability to navigate these relationships earned him the respect of peers and the wary acknowledgement of rivals. One of Carlo's greatest strengths was his understanding of timing and patience. He did not rush to seize power through confrontation or violence. Instead, he let opportunities present themselves, observing the weaknesses and ambitions of others before acting. This approach minimized risk while maximizing reward. Carlo knew that the appearance of calm and control was as powerful as action itself. Men trusted him because he acted deliberately, measuredly, and without unnecessary provocation. Within his own family, Carlo had to manage ambition carefully. Capos and soldiers alike harbored their own goals, and it was his responsibility to ensure that internal disputes did not destabilize the family. He handled conflicts with subtlety, offering incentives, mediating disagreements, and when necessary removing obstacles with precision. Every action reinforced his authority and his vision for the family's future. An organization ruled by strategy, loyalty, and foresight. Carlo also maintained a cautious relationship with law enforcement. He understood the constant threat posed by the police, federal agents, and prosecutors. His approach was one of invisibility. Operations were conducted efficiently but quietly, and any exposure was minimized through careful planning and the cultivation of intermediaries. He knew that being seen but untouchable was a mark of true mastery in the criminal world. Even as he consolidated power, Carlo Gambino remained patient. He did not chase every opportunity for immediate gain. He observed, calculated, and waited for moments that would yield the greatest advantage with the least risk. This patience allowed him to survive internal rivalries, external threats, and the constant pressures of managing an empire built on both fear and respect. Perhaps most importantly, Carlo understood the value of loyalty and trust. He fostered a culture in which those who followed him could rise, provided they demonstrated skill, discretion, and reliability. Betrayal, however, was met with swift and certain consequences. This balance of opportunity and risk ensured that the family remained cohesive, disciplined, and responsive to his guidance. By the mid-1950s, Carlo Gambino's influence had extended beyond Brooklyn. He had established himself as the preeminent figure in New York's organized crime scene, respected by allies and feared by rivals. His family operated efficiently, alliances were maintained, and the balance of power within the five families tilted in his favor. He was no longer merely a capo or a soldier executing orders. He was the architect of a criminal empire, a strategist whose vision extended beyond immediate gains to long-term dominance. In private moments, Carlo reflected on his journey from Palermo to Brooklyn, from courier to capo, and now to boss of bosses. He knew that the path he had taken required more than courage or ambition. it required observation, patience, and an unerring understanding of human nature. Every decision, every alliance, every subtle manipulation had been a step along a carefully plotted path. And the city itself, the streets, the docks, the warehouses, the hidden corners, had been his classroom, teaching lessons that could not be learned in books or schools. Even at the height of his power, Carlo remained vigilant. The city was unpredictable, rivals were ambitious, and betrayal could strike from any direction. Yet he had built a network of influence that made him untouchable in ways that few could comprehend. His rise was not built on brute force alone but on a combination of intelligence, foresight, and the strategic cultivation of loyalty and fear. By the end of this chapter in his life, Carlo Gambino had solidified his role as the boss of bosses, a man whose name commanded respect across New York. He had mastered the intricate dance of power, influence, and strategy, ensuring that the Mangano family and his legacy would endure. And as he moved through the shadows of the city, Carlo Gambino was no longer a participant in the game of organized crime. He was defining it. By the late 1950s, Carlo Gambino had established himself as a figure whose influence extended far beyond the streets of Brooklyn. He was no longer just the boss of bosses in title. His decisions shaped the fates of men, crews, and even entire neighborhoods. Yet with great power came complex challenges, not just from rivals in law enforcement but from within his own circle. Carlo had learned that leadership in the underworld required balance, foresight, and a deep understanding of human nature. One of the earliest lessons he had internalized was the delicate interplay between family and ambition. His own family, the Sicilian relatives who had guided his early life, the brothers and cousins who shared his roots, were both a source of grounding and potential vulnerability. Carlo knew that personal loyalty could conflict with professional loyalty, that favoritism could breed resentment, and that family ties could be exploited by rivals seeking leverage. Every decision had to weigh these competing factors carefully. Carlo's household in Brooklyn reflected this balance. Though he lived modestly, he maintained an environment of respect and discipline. He kept his private life carefully separated from the operations of the family, understanding that visibility could be a liability. Even the choice of friends, business associates, and advisors was strategic. Every interaction was a potential calculation. Who could be trusted, who could influence others, who might eventually pose a threat. Carlo approached these relationships as he had approached every aspect of his rise, with measured attention and foresight. Meanwhile, within the Mangano family itself, the politics of power were complex and ever-shifting. Capos and soldiers each harbored ambitions. Alliances shifted depending on opportunity, fear, and personal interest. Carlo's role was to maintain cohesion while asserting authority, a task requiring subtlety, diplomacy, and occasional decisive action. He became known for resolving disputes with minimal conflict, often preempting violence through negotiation or subtle pressure. Men respected him because he understood not only the operations of the organization but the motivations of those who operated within it. One illustrative episode involved a disagreement between two mid-level crews over the distribution of profits from a new set of rackets. The dispute threatened to escalate into a violent confrontation. Carlo summoned the leaders of both crews to a neutral location, a small, private room in a warehouse off the waterfront. He listened carefully, asking questions that guided each man to articulate his concerns. Without raising his voice or making direct threats, Carlo orchestrated a resolution that left both parties feeling satisfied, while simultaneously reinforcing his authority. The outcome was a testament to his growing mastery of subtle power. Leadership was not always demonstrated through force. Often, it was shown through control of perception and strategic mediation. Carlo's approach to power extended beyond his immediate family. He recognized that influence in the five families required attention to the broader network of alliances and rivalries. He observed interactions between families, monitored tensions, and sought opportunities to strengthen his position without unnecessary conflict. In these negotiations, patience was his ally. He avoided impulsive action, instead letting events unfold, gathering intelligence and intervening at the optimal moment. Through this method, he maintained respect and authority while minimizing risk. Personal loyalty was another cornerstone of Carlo's strategy. He cultivated relationships with men who had demonstrated reliability, discretion, and competence. He rewarded service and loyalty, sometimes subtly, sometimes more openly, but always in a way that reinforced the hierarchy and cemented bonds. Conversely, betrayal was met with swift, calculated consequences, ensuring that potential threats were neutralized before they could grow. This balance of reward and deterrence was a hallmark of his leadership style, creating a culture in which loyalty was both expected and honored. At the same time, Carlo had to contend with external threats. Law enforcement attention was constant, and rival families were always looking for advantage. He carefully monitored these dynamics, making strategic decisions to maintain the family's operations while minimizing exposure. Intelligence was a key component of survival. Carlo relied on observation, communication through trusted intermediaries, and careful planning to anticipate challenges and respond effectively. He understood that knowledge was power, and that foresight could prevent crises before they began. In addition to operational concerns, Carlo remained keenly aware of the symbolic power of reputation. How he was perceived by allies, rivals, and even casual observers influenced behavior. Men were more likely to follow a leader who appeared confident, controlled, and capable. Carlo projected calm authority, even in moments of tension, cultivating an image that reinforced his influence without the need for overt displays of force. It was a subtle, almost invisible form of power, but one that was extraordinarily effective in maintaining his position. Carlo's ability to balance these competing pressures, family loyalty, internal politics, external threats, and the cultivation of reputation, was a testament to his strategic mind. He understood that power was fragile, contingent upon perception as much as action. He also understood that leadership required patience, the willingness to observe, and the discipline to act decisively only when the conditions were right. These principles would guide him throughout the next decades, shaping not only his own rise but the trajectory of the entire family. By the end of this period, Carlo Gambino had mastered the subtle politics that underpinned the world of organized crime in New York. He was a man of discretion, intelligence, and measured authority, capable of navigating the complex interplay of loyalty, ambition, and power. The streets of Brooklyn, the networks of the Mangano family, and the broader dynamics of the five families had forged him into a leader who commanded respect not through intimidation alone, but through understanding, strategy, and foresight. Carlo's journey was far from complete. Challenges remained, rivals plotted, and the pressures of leadership never ceased. Yet he had established a foundation of power, a reputation that extended across the city, and the strategic insight necessary to maintain his position. The Gambino family, and eventually the entire landscape of New York's underworld, would come to reflect his vision, discipline, and the subtle mastery of power that distinguished him from all others. As Chapter 6 closes, Carlo Gambino stands at a pinnacle he has earned through decades of careful planning, observation, and strategic action. He has navigated the treacherous waters of family, loyalty, and politics with skill and patience. And though the path ahead will be filled with challenges, betrayals, and high-stakes decisions, Carlo is prepared, ready to consolidate power further, to expand influence, and to define the very structure of organized crime in New York. Brooklyn's underworld was vast, layered, and ruthless. While Carlo Gambino consolidated his power within the Mangano family, another figure was quietly beginning his ascent, not with notoriety or flashy violence, but with patience, discretion, and a calculating mind. Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a young Italian-American with Sicilian roots, had learned early that visibility often invited danger, and silence could be the most powerful weapon of all. Tony was born into a modest immigrant household, where ambition had to be tempered by pragmatism. His father had instilled in him a respect for discipline and hard work, while his mother reminded him that perception mattered more than force. From a young age, Tony understood that survival in Brooklyn required observation, subtlety, and the ability to read the intentions of others. He watched men in the neighborhood, noting their mannerisms, their alliances, and the strategies they used to navigate the complex social terrain. Unlike Carlo, whose early steps involved direct engagement with crews and street conflicts, Tony began quietly, as a driver and courier, a man who delivered messages, goods, and occasionally subtle threats without drawing attention. The moniker Tony Ducks emerged not from cowardice, but from his ability to evade scrutiny, to move unseen, and to navigate dangerous situations with almost preternatural timing. Where others might stumble, Tony flowed around obstacles, never visible but always present, always calculating. His early work with the Lucchese family was unremarkable on the surface but deeply instructive. He observed capos, soldiers, and associates in their routines, learning the structure and strategy of a well-run crime family. He understood the chain of command, the importance of loyalty, and the consequences of miscalculation. Every minor task, delivering packages, relaying messages, performing favors, was a lesson in patience, discretion, and influence. He internalized the power of observation, knowing who could be trusted, who might betray, and when an opportunity would present itself. Tony's reputation began to grow not through violence or overt showmanship, but through competence and reliability. Other young men took note of his calm demeanor and the subtle ways he navigated tense situations. Capos appreciated his discretion, soldiers respected his insight. Even rivals took note of his quiet intelligence. In the criminal underworld, where appearances often outweighed reality, Tony's careful cultivation of perception became a cornerstone of his rise. The first real test of Tony's acumen came during a dispute over a small gambling operation in the Bronx. Two minor crews claimed control over the same territory, and tensions threatened to boil into open conflict. Tony, acting on behalf of his superiors, was sent to observe, mediate, and report. He listened to arguments, watched body language, and anticipated each reaction. Without intervening aggressively, he suggested compromises, pointed out mutual benefits, and guided the negotiation toward a peaceful resolution. By the time the meeting ended, both sides had retreated without incident, but Tony had earned the quiet respect of his family and the attention of the Lucchese leadership. Over the next several years, Tony's responsibilities expanded incrementally. He managed collections, coordinated logistics for high-value shipments, and handled sensitive communications between crews. Each task was an opportunity to observe human behavior, refine strategy, and demonstrate reliability. Unlike those who sought immediate recognition, Tony understood that his rise depended on patience, discretion, and the ability to anticipate outcomes. By avoiding unnecessary attention and carefully cultivating influence, he positioned himself as a man indispensable to his family's operations. Tony's nickname, Dux, became symbolic of his style. In situations where others might panic or act rashly, he moved with precision, eluding danger and turning threats into opportunities. Whether avoiding scrutiny from law enforcement or navigating rival factions, Tony's reputation for calm, calculated movement preceded him. His ability to remain unseen yet influential became a key factor in his steady ascent within the Lucchese family. His rise was also marked by subtle networking. Tony understood that loyalty within the family and influence beyond its borders were equally important. He cultivated relationships with capos, soldiers, and key associates, offering favors, guidance, and discreet assistance when appropriate. By positioning himself as reliable and insightful, he ensured that his opinion carried weight without ever appearing aggressive or ambitious. In the delicate ecosystem of organized crime, this approach allowed him to navigate rivalries and power struggles without drawing dangerous attention. During this time, Tony also became aware of the broader landscape of New York's criminal world. He understood that families such as Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno operated with their own ambitions and rivalries. While his interactions with Carlo Gambino were indirect at this stage, Tony observed Gambino's rise and methods with keen interest. He studied how Gambino consolidated power, managed internal dynamics, and navigated the complex politics of the five families. These lessons informed Tony's own strategy. Patience, observation, and calculated intervention would be his path to influence. One pivotal moment in Tony's early career involved managing a sensitive debt collection across multiple territories. A rival crew attempted to challenge Lucchese control, threatening to disrupt operations. Tony coordinated the effort, arranging for discreet meetings, mediating disputes, and ensuring that the operation concluded successfully without violence. His meticulous planning and ability to anticipate problems impressed the family's leadership. From that point forward, Tony's reliability was unquestioned, and he began to assume more strategic responsibilities. By the late 1960s, Anthony "Tony Dux" Corallo had transformed from a cautious driver and observer into a respected figure within the Lucchese family. His reputation for intelligence, patience, and discretion distinguished him from more impulsive or aggressive members. He had built a network of influence that allowed him to navigate the underworld effectively, gaining trust and authority while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Tony's rise was a study in strategic subtlety. He avoided flamboyant violence, preferring influence and negotiation over brute force. He cultivated relationships that strengthened his position and understood the delicate balance between reward and deterrence. Men followed him because they trusted his judgment, not because they feared him, a rare quality in the world of organized crime. Even as he gained influence, Tony remained cautious of overreach. He observed the Gambino family, noting both Carlo's methods and the respect he commanded across Brooklyn and Manhattan. While their operations were separate, the dynamics of influence, loyalty, and strategic positioning were similar. Tony understood that any misstep could jeopardize his carefully constructed network, and he acted with patience and precision. By the end of this period, Tony Dux was no longer merely a capable operative. He was a man positioned to rise to the top of the Lucchese family. His patience, intelligence, and ability to navigate the subtle politics of organized crime ensured that he would not only survive but thrive. And as he continued to move through the shadows of Brooklyn and beyond, he began to forge the alliances, strategies, and reputation that would eventually place him alongside figures like Carlo Gambino at the pinnacle of New York's criminal hierarchy. By the early 1970s, Tony Dux Corallo had firmly established himself as more than just a capable operative within the Lucchese family. He was quietly becoming a figure whose judgment, discretion, and strategic thinking distinguished him from the more impulsive and violent members of the organization. While many in the underworld relied on brute force and intimidation, Tony understood that influence often flowed from subtlety, observation, and the careful management of relationships. His early years had been a training ground. The careful observation, the minor errands, the discreet interventions, all of it culminated in a skill set that made him invaluable. Lucchese leadership recognized his talents, and gradually he was entrusted with responsibilities that went beyond simple courier work. He began overseeing collections, coordinating operations across multiple neighborhoods, and managing personnel who were themselves becoming ambitious. Each task, each operation was both a test and a lesson, further refining his understanding of the mechanics of power. One of Tony's first significant operations involved the management of a high-value gambling network that spanned Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. The operation required precise coordination. Multiple crews were involved, each responsible for different territories and revenue streams. Miscommunication or mismanagement could result in lost revenue, disruption of alliances, or even violent confrontation. Tony approached the task with methodical precision. He mapped the territories, assigned responsibilities based on skill and reliability, and established communication protocols that minimized exposure while maximizing efficiency. The operation ran smoothly, earning him recognition not only within his family but also among allied crews in neighboring territories. Tony's rise was not without danger. Rival families, particularly the Genovese and Gambino operations, kept a careful eye on Lucchese movements. Tony understood the delicate balance required to maintain authority while avoiding direct conflict with these powerful neighbors. He cultivated relationships that allowed him to gather intelligence, anticipate threats, and negotiate outcomes without drawing unnecessary attention. His reputation for foresight and discretion meant that he was often consulted on matters of strategy, even beyond the immediate scope of his formal duties. At the same time, Tony had to manage the internal dynamics of the Lucchese family. Ambitious capos and soldiers could disrupt operations through greed, recklessness, or rivalry. Tony learned to navigate these internal tensions with subtlety. He mediated disputes, assigned responsibilities in ways that balanced influence, and ensured that loyalty was reinforced through both reward and consequence. Men followed him not because they feared him, though they did, but because they recognized his judgment and the stability he brought to the organization. One pivotal moment came during a dispute over a lucrative construction contract in Queens. Two crews both claimed the right to collect protection from the same developer. A direct confrontation could have escalated into violence, drawing unwanted law enforcement attention. Tony intervened quietly. He met with the leaders individually, assessing their motivations, temperaments, and willingness to compromise. Then, through a series of strategic suggestions and subtle pressure, he brokered a resolution that left both crews satisfied while reinforcing Lucchese authority. The developer paid, the crews maintained face, and Tony's reputation as a capable mediator solidified. Through these successes, Tony Dux became known as the man to handle sensitive operations. He was entrusted with tasks that required intelligence, patience, and discretion, often operating in the shadows while ensuring that outcomes favored his family. His approach contrasted sharply with the more flamboyant or aggressive members of the underworld. He understood that survival and influence were not about who could strike the hardest or the loudest, but about who could see, anticipate, and manipulate outcomes with precision. Tony's careful cultivation of loyalty was also critical to his rise. He recognized that influence was not maintained solely through authority but through relationships built on trust, reciprocity, and perception. He rewarded reliability, reinforced positive behavior, and addressed potential threats quietly, ensuring that the family remained cohesive and disciplined. This method allowed him to extend his influence while minimizing the risk of internal conflict that could destabilize the organization. As Tony's responsibilities grew, He began to observe the operations of other families more closely. The Gambino family, under Carlo Gambino, represented a model of strategic leadership and control that Tony admired. While direct interactions were limited at this stage, Tony studied Gambino's approach. His patience, his management of internal dynamics, and his ability to project authority without unnecessary violence. These observations informed Tony's own strategy: patient accumulation of power, careful management of relationships, and precise execution of operations would pave his path to leadership. Tony also began to exercise influence in financial operations. He oversaw revenue streams, managed the movement of cash and assets, and ensured that accounting and reporting maintained discretion. This exposure provided insight into the broader mechanics of organized crime, how power was maintained not only on the streets but through careful control of money, information, and perception. Tony understood that a leader who controlled these flows could shape the organization without resorting to overt displays of force. By the late 1970s, Tony Dux had transformed into a formidable figure within the Lucchese family. He had risen from a cautious observer to a trusted executor of the family's strategy. His reputation for intelligence, patience, and discretion distinguished him from more impulsive peers. He had built a network of loyal operatives, cultivated relationships with allies, and learned to navigate the complex politics of New York's underworld. He was ready for higher responsibilities, including direct oversight of the family's most critical operations and eventual succession toward leadership. Tony's rise also marked the beginning of his indirect intersection with Carlo Gambino. While their families operated independently, the broader dynamics of the five families meant that leaders had to observe one another carefully. Tony understood Gambino's methods, influence, and approach to loyalty, recognizing parallels and lessons he could apply to his own ascent. Both men shared a philosophy: patience, strategic observation, and precise action were more powerful than impulsive aggression. By the end of this phase in Tony's life, he was no longer a background figure in the Lucchese family. He had become an architect of strategy, a mediator of disputes, and a builder of influence. His calculated approach, subtle diplomacy, and disciplined execution positioned him to eventually take the reins of the family and navigate the treacherous world of New York organized crime with the same skill and foresight as Carlo Gambino had done within his own domain. Tony Dux's emergence was not marked by violence or spectacle, but by quiet competence, patience, and intelligence. In the complex ecosystem of the underworld, these qualities were more potent than any gun or fist. And as he continued to build his reputation, Tony laid the foundation for a career that would see him rise to the pinnacle of the Lucchese family, earning a place among the most influential figures in American organized crime. The world of New York's organized crime in the late 1970s was a delicate balance of power, strategy, and subtle intimidation. Carlo Gambino had long established himself as the boss of bosses, a man whose reputation and foresight extended across the five families. Anthony "Tony Dux" Corallo was rising steadily within the Lucchese family, respected for his patience, discretion, and intelligence. Both men understood that survival and dominance depended not merely on brute force, but on anticipating betrayals, understanding human ambition, and executing calculated strategies. It began with whispers. Small disputes that seemed inconsequential at first revealed a deeper undercurrent of tension between crews, capos, and families. Carlo's keen perception detected subtle shifts in loyalty, minor infractions that could signal potential rebellion, and conversations that hinted at plots yet to surface. Similarly, Tony Dux received reports of crews questioning orders, of rival factions testing the boundaries of influence. Both men understood that in this world, one misstep could trigger cascading consequences. The first test came when a minor capo in the Gambino family attempted to assert autonomy over certain rackets that were under Carlo's purview. It was a subtle challenge, executed without open confrontation but with enough insinuation to test Carlo's response. He observed quietly, gathering intelligence through intermediaries and trusted associates. Direct confrontation could provoke unnecessary violence, yet ignoring the challenge could embolden others. Carlo chose a measured response. He summoned the capo discreetly, assessed his motivations, and employed a combination of persuasion and subtle threat to realign the subordinates' loyalty. The situation resolved without bloodshed, reinforcing Carlo's reputation for strategic control. Simultaneously, Tony Dux faced a parallel scenario within the Lucchese family. A rising soldier had begun encroaching on territories managed by Tony's crew, testing the limits of his authority. Tony monitored the situation carefully, collecting information and understanding the ambitions of the soldier and his allies. Rather than responding with immediate force, Tony orchestrated a series of subtle moves, reassigning responsibilities, cultivating alliances among other capos, and positioning loyal operatives strategically. The soldiers' challenge dissipated without direct confrontation, demonstrating Tony's growing mastery of influence and negotiation. Across the city, rival families were also maneuvering. The Genovese family sought to expand their influence in northern Brooklyn, while the Colombo family tested Lucchese operations in Queens. Carlo and Tony, though operating independently, recognized the importance of monitoring these movements. Carlo's network allowed him to intercept potential threats early, while Tony relied on trusted operatives to report rival activity. Both men understood that preemption, intelligence, and strategic intervention were critical to maintaining dominance. Within this tense landscape, betrayals began to surface. Allies who had once seemed steadfast revealed ambitions that could not be ignored. Minor infractions escalated into threats of open rebellion. Carlo and Tony each had to assess not only the immediate danger but the long-term implications for their respective families. Decisions could not be rushed. They had to consider perception, timing, and the likely reactions of others. One misjudgment could spark a feud, attract law enforcement attention, or weaken influence irreversibly. Carlo's response combined psychological insight with strategic action. He reinforced loyalty among key capos through selective favor, discreet guidance, and, when necessary, calibrated demonstrations of power. He managed potential threats by aligning incentives, subtly reminding ambitious subordinates of the consequences of disloyalty, and ensuring that any misalignment of ambition was addressed before it became dangerous. Carlo's approach emphasized subtlety and control, allowing him to maintain authority without provoking unnecessary confrontation. Tony Dux applied similar principles within the Lucchese family. He strengthened ties with loyal operatives, mitigated tensions among ambitious soldiers, and maintained lines of communication that allowed for early intervention. Tony recognized that influence depended on perception as much as action. By projecting confidence and fairness, he neutralized potential rebellion while enhancing his own authority. His patience and discretion became defining qualities, allowing him to operate with precision while minimizing risk. The interplay of plots, betrayals, and strategic responses reached a critical point during a confrontation over a high-value construction contract in Manhattan. Multiple families claimed interest, with crews from Gambino, Lucchese, and Genovese all asserting influence. The potential for violence was significant, and law enforcement scrutiny was increasing. Carlo and Tony each coordinated internal strategies. Carlo ensured that his family's capos acted in cohesion and avoided unnecessary provocation, while Tony positioned loyal soldiers to maintain control over contested territories. Both men relied on intelligence, timing, and subtle negotiation to achieve outcomes favorable to their families. The resolution of this confrontation required not force, but diplomacy, observation, and calculated risk. Carlo met privately with other family heads, negotiating agreements that preserved influence while minimizing friction. Tony facilitated communication among his capos, ensuring that any enforcement actions were coordinated and discreet. In the end, the dispute was settled with minimal violence, preserving relationships, reinforcing authority, and demonstrating the effectiveness of strategic management over impulsive aggression. During this period, Carlo and Tony also became increasingly aware of the delicate role of perception. How other families viewed their decisions, how subordinates interpreted actions, and how rivals anticipated responses, all of these factors influenced outcomes. Both men understood that maintaining dominance required careful management of appearances, restraint when necessary, decisive action when required, and the ability to project authority without unnecessary exposure. They operated in a world where subtle missteps could be exploited and where patience was as powerful as action. Betrayals were managed swiftly. Carlo and Tony both understood that unchecked disloyalty could destabilize entire operations. Within their families, potential traitors were identified, assessed, and either neutralized or reintegrated through calculated incentives. This approach maintained cohesion, minimized disruption, and reinforced the central authority of leadership. It was a careful balance. Excessive force could provoke fear or resentment, while leniency could embolden further challenges. Both men executed this balance with precision, demonstrating strategic insight and command. By the end of this period, Carlo Gambino and Tony Dux Corallo had solidified their reputations as leaders who could manage both loyalty and ambition, anticipate threats, and navigate the complex landscape of New York organized crime. Their families operated efficiently, rivalries were contained, and the subtle balance of power within the five families remained intact. Both men had demonstrated that leadership in the underworld depended not on brute force alone, but on strategy, perception, patience, and the precise management of human behavior. This phase of their careers underscored a crucial principle. In a world defined by ambition, rivalry, and opportunity, those who survived and thrived were not necessarily the strongest or the most violent. They were the most perceptive, the most patient, and the most strategic. Carlo and Tony exemplified these qualities, positioning themselves and their families for long-term influence and stability in a city defined by constant tension and potential betrayal. By the late 1970s, the underworld of New York was under closer scrutiny than ever before. Law enforcement agencies, fueled by public pressure and decades of crime, had sharpened their focus on the five families. Carlo Gambino, entrenched at the top of the criminal hierarchy, and Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, rising steadily within Lucchese, both understood that while influence and loyalty were vital internally, the threat from outside the family could not be ignored. The shadows they had navigated for decades were beginning to be illuminated, and the stakes had never been higher. Carlo had always been cautious. His rise to boss of bosses had been defined by patience, observation, and calculated action. Yet now, with federal agencies ramping up surveillance, infiltrating operations, and offering incentives for insiders to testify, even a man of his acumen had to adapt. Every move required planning, foresight, and contingency strategies. He relied on trusted intermediaries, maintaining a buffer between himself and any potentially incriminating activity. Gambino's philosophy was clear: remain untouchable and let others absorb the risk of exposure. The FBI's operations had grown sophisticated. Surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover agents infiltrated the networks of organized crime with increasing effectiveness. Gambino's crews became more cautious, communications more discreet, and meetings more clandestine. Carlo emphasized the importance of compartmentalization. Information was distributed on a need-to-know basis, tasks were assigned with clear boundaries, and intermediaries acted as buffers. Every chain of command was scrutinized, every routine operation re-examined for vulnerability. Carlo understood that survival now required intelligence as much as influence. Meanwhile, Tony Ducks faced similar pressures within the Lucchese family. His rise had been marked by patience, discretion, and strategic influence, but now law enforcement posed a direct challenge. Tony applied the same principles that had guided his ascent: observation, anticipation, and calculated intervention. He monitored federal activity, evaluated potential threats from within his own ranks, and maintained strict control over communications and operations. By cultivating loyalty and discipline among his subordinates, Tony ensured that even under scrutiny, the family's core operations remained intact. One particularly tense episode occurred when federal agents intercepted a shipment of cash that had been routed through multiple hands. While the operation itself had been handled with care, the interception signaled that the authorities were closing in. Carlo immediately convened his inner circle, reviewing the flow of operations, identifying potential points of exposure, and adjusting protocols. By acting swiftly and decisively, he ensured that the incident did not compromise broader operations or endanger personnel. His response was measured, strategic, and effective, reinforcing his reputation as a leader capable of navigating both internal and external threats. Tony Ducks faced his own challenges with legal scrutiny. A minor dispute between crews escalated when surveillance reports flagged unusual financial activity. Tony's response was methodical. He restructured the operation, reassigned responsibilities, and ensured that all interactions with sensitive transactions were handled by trusted, discreet operatives. By the time authorities attempted to trace the flow of funds, they found nothing directly linking leadership to any illegal activity. Tony's careful management demonstrated not only competence but foresight, a hallmark of his leadership style. Both men also understood the importance of managing relationships outside the family. Lawyers, accountants, and intermediaries played critical roles in shielding operations from scrutiny. Carlo and Tony cultivated networks of professionals who could provide cover, advice, and insight without compromising loyalty or operational security. These relationships required trust and discretion, and both men approached them with the same strategic patience they applied internally. Internal discipline was equally crucial. Gambino and Tony both reinforced strict protocols within their families. Members were reminded of the importance of secrecy, adherence to orders, and measured behavior. Any hint of indiscretion or willingness to cooperate with authorities was addressed swiftly and decisively. The message was clear: loyalty and silence were non-negotiable. By establishing these boundaries, both leaders maintained cohesion and minimized the risk of infiltration or betrayal. Despite the pressures, Carlo and Tony continued to expand their influence. Their operations adapted to the new scrutiny. Meetings were shortened, routes altered, and communication encrypted through layers of intermediaries. They relied on a network of trusted subordinates who understood the stakes and executed orders with precision. Both men demonstrated that power was not merely about territory or violence, but about the ability to anticipate threats, mitigate risk, and act decisively when necessary. A pivotal moment came when federal authorities attempted to leverage insiders to testify against leadership. Carlo responded by carefully assessing loyalty within the family, reinforcing bonds, and strategically repositioning personnel to ensure critical operations were insulated. Tony Dux, facing a similar threat, managed potential informants with discretion, offering incentives for continued loyalty while monitoring potential weaknesses. Both men's approaches reflected a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, risk management, and the long-term consequences of decisions. By the early 1980s, the efforts of law enforcement had intensified. High-profile investigations, surveillance programs, and targeted prosecutions were creating pressure across the five families. Yet Gambino and Tony Dux maintained their positions. Their ability to anticipate, adapt, and execute strategic decisions allowed them to navigate this period of heightened scrutiny without compromising core operations. Both men had demonstrated that leadership in organized crime required intelligence, patience, discretion, and the capacity to manage both human and operational risk. The culmination of this phase of their careers underscored a critical principle. Authority and survival were inseparable from strategy, foresight, and adaptability. Both Carlo Gambino and Tony Dux Corallo had built networks resilient to external pressures, cultivated loyalty among subordinates, and managed the perception of power in a city increasingly under scrutiny. Their reputations for intelligence, discretion, and calculated action made them nearly untouchable, even as the world around them shifted. In private reflection, Carlo and Tony understood that their success depended on balance, the careful management of family, operations, loyalty, and external pressures. They had learned to act decisively while remaining patient, to wield influence subtly while commanding respect, and to anticipate threats before they materialized. Their rise was not defined by aggression alone, but by the meticulous application of strategy and the disciplined exercise of power. By the end of this chapter, both men had solidified their positions within the American underworld. Carlo Gambino maintained supremacy as boss of bosses, respected across the five families, while Tony Dux had established himself as a rising force within Lucchese, poised to consolidate power further. Together, their actions, strategies, and decisions exemplified the careful, patient, and intelligent exercise of authority in a world defined by ambition, danger, and the constant threat of betrayal. By the mid-1980s, the landscape of New York's underworld had shifted. Carlo Gambino, the man who had once defined authority as boss of bosses, was aging. Decades of careful strategy, patience, and calculated action had built an empire that spanned Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and beyond. Yet no empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, is immune to the passage of time. Even the most formidable figures face mortality, internal pressures, and the inevitability of change. Gambino's health had begun to decline. The years of constant vigilance, careful orchestration, and management of complex networks took their toll. He remained sharp, but the subtle decisions that once defined the family increasingly relied on trusted lieutenants and capos to execute his directives. The Mangano family, now firmly under his influence, had been transformed from a collection of street crews into a cohesive, disciplined network. Operations ran efficiently, rivalries were contained, and loyalty was reinforced at every level. Yet the absence of Gambino's commanding presence, even for brief periods, introduced new challenges. During this period, Tony Dux Corallo's star continued to rise. Within the Lucchese family, Tony had cemented his reputation as a strategist, a mediator, and a leader capable of navigating the treacherous politics of the underworld. He managed collections, supervised operations, and maintained discipline among ambitious soldiers. More importantly, Tony had internalized a lesson he had observed in Gambino, that influence depended not only on action, but on perception, patience, and the careful orchestration of loyalty and fear. The news of Gambino's declining health reverberated across the five families. Allies and rivals alike speculated on the implications. Who would assume control? Would succession be smooth or would internal conflict erupt? For Tony Dux, this represented both a cautionary tale and a strategic observation. He noted the strengths Gambino had built into his family, the emphasis on loyalty, the compartmentalization of operations, and the careful cultivation of alliances, and he considered how similar principles could be applied within Lucchese to maintain stability and authority. Gambino's eventual passing was significant but measured. Within the family, operations continued without disruption, a testament to the structures he had put in place. His successors were chosen carefully, individuals capable of maintaining the balance of power and ensuring continuity. The streets, docks, and rackets of Brooklyn witnessed a quiet transition. There was no chaotic power struggle, no violent upheaval. Carlo Gambino had ensured that his legacy would endure not just through fear, but through the disciplined structure and loyalty he had cultivated over decades. Tony Dux observed these events closely. The Gambino example reinforced his understanding of leadership and succession within the underworld. He recognized that power was fragile, dependent on both perception and careful management. Within Lucchese, Tony applied similar principles. He strengthened networks of loyal capos, reinforced protocols for operational security, and maintained a culture that rewarded reliability while deterring betrayal. The death of Gambino was a reminder that leadership required foresight, preparation, and the cultivation of systems that could withstand both internal and external pressures. During this period, tensions across the five families began to shift. Rivalries that had been dormant during Gambino's tenure resurfaced. Alliances were tested as families recalibrated in response to the changing power dynamics. Tony Dux managed these pressures with calculated precision. He strengthened Lucchese influence through strategic alliances, careful negotiation, and the selective demonstration of authority. By anticipating the ambitions and weaknesses of rival families, Tony ensured that Lucchese operations remained secure, profitable, and influential. Internally, Tony continued to emphasize discipline and loyalty. He had observed the potential for internal conflict following Gambino's passing and sought to prevent similar vulnerabilities within his own family. Soldiers and capos were reminded of the consequences of disloyalty, while loyalty and competence were rewarded strategically. Tony's approach balanced subtle influence with firm management, ensuring that the family remained cohesive and capable of responding to both opportunities and threats. As the underworld adapted to Gambino's absence, Tony Dux solidified his position as a central figure in Lucchese. His reputation for intelligence, discretion, and strategic action distinguished him from both peers and rivals. While Gambino's empire continued under new leadership, Tony's careful cultivation of power ensured that Lucchese remained a formidable force, capable of defending its interests and expanding influence where possible. The passing of Carlo Gambino also prompted reflection within the broader underworld. He had left a legacy defined not only by power and influence but by the principles that guided his leadership: patience, observation, strategic action, and the disciplined management of loyalty and fear. Both allies and rivals recognized that his tenure had set a standard for leadership, demonstrating that true authority relied as much on foresight and strategy as on force. For Tony Dux, these lessons were deeply instructive. He had internalized the value of patient accumulation of influence, the importance of strategic planning, and the necessity of cultivating networks of loyalty. The challenges he faced in maintaining and expanding Lucchese operations mirrored those Gambino had managed decades earlier. Tony approached each decision with careful analysis, balancing ambition with risk, authority with discretion, and immediate gain with long-term stability. By the end of this period, the landscape of New York's organized crime had evolved. Carlo Gambino's era had concluded, leaving behind a legacy of stability, structure, and strategic mastery. Tony Dux, Corallo had emerged as a leader capable of navigating the complexities of his own family and the broader Five Families network. Both men exemplified the principles that had defined the most successful figures in organized crime: intelligence, patience, discretion, and the ability to manage both human and operational variables with precision. The streets, docks, warehouses, and backroom offices of Brooklyn and Manhattan were quieter in some ways, yet the undercurrent of ambition, loyalty, and strategy remained. Carlo Gambino's influence endured through the systems he had established, while Tony Dux positioned himself to carry forward a vision of disciplined, strategic leadership within Lucchese. The balance of power had shifted, but the principles that governed it, the careful interplay of observation, loyalty, patience, and strategic action, remained constant. In the end, Carlo Gambino's legacy was not measured merely by his control of territory or revenue, but by the resilience and structure he had instilled in his family. Tony Dux's rise demonstrated that these lessons could be adapted, applied, and extended. Together, their actions, strategies, and understanding of the human elements of power ensured that the underworld of New York remained a complex, disciplined, and highly strategic arena, one in which the consequences of action, inaction, and misjudgment could be profound. The world Carlo Gambino and Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo had inhabited was one of shadows, strategy, and unspoken codes. For decades, they had navigated the complex terrain of New York's organized crime, balancing loyalty, ambition, and the constant threat of betrayal. Their stories were intertwined with the rise and resilience of the five families, shaping not only the streets of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, but also the very rules that govern the underworld. Carlo Gambino's journey had begun in Palermo, Sicily, where the lessons of observation, patience, and subtle influence were first etched into his mind. Those early years had prepared him for the harsh realities of Brooklyn, where survival demanded calculation and foresight. From courier to soldier, capo to boss of bosses, Gambino had built an empire through careful strategy rather than overt violence. His approach had been methodical: alliances cultivated quietly, threats neutralized discreetly, loyalty enforced with precision. By the time of his passing, he had left behind an organization disciplined, structured, and resilient, a blueprint for power in a city defined by both opportunity and danger. Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo's rise mirrored the lessons he had observed in Gambino, though forged in the distinct environment of the Lucchese family. Tony had begun as a cautious driver and operative, observing, learning, and internalizing the subtleties of influence. His patience, discretion, and strategic mind allowed him to ascend steadily, gaining trust, managing operations, and navigating both internal dynamics and external threats. He understood, as Gambino had, that power was as much about perception as action, as much about patience as decisiveness. His eventual position within Lucchese reflected decades of careful planning, observation, and disciplined execution. Together, the narratives of Gambino and Corallo illustrated the delicate balance of authority in organized crime. The streets, docks, warehouses, and backroom offices of New York were arenas where perception, strategy, and human behavior dictated outcomes. Both men had mastered these elements, demonstrating that true leadership in the underworld relied not merely on violence, but on intelligence, foresight, and the careful management of loyalty, fear, and ambition. Throughout their careers, both men had confronted betrayals, rivalries, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. They had witnessed alliances fracture and ambitions flare, yet they had navigated these challenges with discipline. Carlo Gambino's handling of internal challenges ensured the cohesion of the Mangano family. Tony Ducks' management within Lucchese allowed the organization to remain strong amid increasing scrutiny from authorities and competitors. Their capacity to anticipate, mitigate, and act decisively was a hallmark of their influence. The legacy of these men extended beyond immediate control or profit. Carlo's empire demonstrated the value of structure, observation, and patient accumulation of power. He had created a model where decisions were calculated, loyalty rewarded, and risk minimized. Tony's trajectory within Lucchese reflected a similar philosophy: strategic influence, careful cultivation of relationships, and disciplined oversight ensured long-term resilience and authority. Together, their careers offered a masterclass in leadership under extreme conditions, where the consequences of error could be fatal. Their influence reshaped the underworld itself. The five families operated within a framework that emphasized coordination, negotiation, and strategic control. Conflicts were often resolved through dialogue, mediation, or subtle pressure rather than impulsive violence. Both Gambino and Corallo recognized that sustainable power depended on the ability to manage both the ambitions of allies and the threats posed by rivals. Their methods fostered an environment in which calculated patience and strategic foresight were more effective than brute force alone. Carlo's passing and Tony's continued rise underscored the evolution of organized crime in New York. The Mangano family remained stable under new leadership, reflecting the enduring structures Carlo had established. The Lucchese family, under Tony's guidance, adapted to changing circumstances, law enforcement pressures, and the ambitions of its members while maintaining cohesion and influence. Both men had ensured that their respective families could endure beyond individual lifetimes, institutionalizing the principles that had guided their ascent. The stories of Gambino and Corallo were also a testament to the intersection of intelligence, strategy, and human psychology. They understood that control was not exerted merely through fear or violence but through the careful orchestration of perception, loyalty, and influence. They anticipated the ambitions of others, leveraged opportunities with precision, and mitigated risks before they became threats. Their leadership was defined by foresight, patience, and the disciplined execution of complex strategies. In reflecting upon their legacies, one sees the contours of a city and a criminal landscape shaped by their vision. The streets, docks, and neighborhoods of New York bore witness to the influence of men who understood the mechanics of power, the psychology of loyalty, and the nuances of human ambition. Their actions and decisions reverberated through decades, influencing not only the five families but the broader dynamics of organized crime in America. Carlo Gambino and Tony Ducks Corallo exemplified the enduring principles of leadership under extreme conditions. Gambino's disciplined patience and strategic acumen allowed him to rise from immigrant boy to boss of bosses, leaving a blueprint for others to follow. Corallo's intelligence, discretion, and calculated execution enabled him to navigate the complexities of the Lucchese family, positioning himself as a leader capable of preserving and expanding power. Both men demonstrated that survival and influence depended as much on foresight, perception, and human understanding as on any physical act. As the chapter closes, the legacy of Gambino and Corallo is clear. They were architects of influence, masters of strategy, and exemplars of leadership in a world defined by danger, ambition, and constant negotiation. Their stories offer insight into the dynamics of power, the subtleties of human behavior, and the enduring principles that allow leaders to rise and sustain authority in even the most challenging environments. The city they navigated, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and beyond, remains forever shaped by their decisions. They leave behind not only a record of operations and alliances but also a profound lesson in the art of strategy, patience, and the careful cultivation of loyalty and influence. The legend of Carlo Gambino and Tony Ducks Corallo endures, a testament to the intricate, disciplined, and often invisible forces that govern power in the shadows of New York's underworld.